Hi there, my friends. Dr. David Hall here. Today on Church Psychology, we're going to talk about the tension and the balance between living an authentic life in a way that is accurately presenting itself into the world in a way that's truthful, while also balancing being wise and considering your boundaries. That the idea that not everybody needs to necessarily see every piece of you, how to discern that in a way that hopefully is wise and grounded. That's what we're going to get into today. Hit that intro music.
Welcome to Church Psychology, a podcast of the Negev Institute. We are mental health professionals looking at the intersections of social and behavioral science in the Christian life. Please connect with our free resources in our open community library at churchpsychology.org. We would be grateful if you would follow, like, or subscribe to Church Psychology wherever you are finding us, and also leave us a review. As we start, if we are to love the Lord our God with all of our mind, it makes sense to work on our headspace. So let's get to work. Well, welcome everybody to the Church Psychology Podcast. My name is Matt Scheuneman. I'm here again with Dr. David Hall. Hey, David.
Hey, Matt. Great to be here.
For those who are watching online, you're in a new space.
Hey, I'm recording from home today.
Hey-o.
But, it is, my cat may walk in at some point and be put out that I'm not giving her my full attention, but that's okay.
This is the second time we've talked about cats. So
Cats.
yeah, some people do. Some people like cats. That's true.
Yeah, I'm assuming that means you're not one of those people. That's okay. That's okay. So, back to the brain and Jesus.
Yeah, well, that's what we talk about. But
That's what we talk about.
We welcome you all to our conversation. Yes.
Yeah. Here's what we're going to talk about today.
Yes, let's hear it.
So there's a phrase that Matt introduced me to because it's one that he uses in therapy, and it's one that I've started to use in my own therapy sessions a bit. And it's funny, you pick up different things. Either you take a class or you read a book or you hear somebody say things, and it's interesting it's a really sticky concept to you when you find yourself as a therapist, when you find yourself weaving it into your therapy sessions a lot. And
well, yeah, and you start seeing it kind of come up, and I don't know if that's just from exposure, but the conversations, you're not just forcing it in there. They come natural because it's relevant to, this is a relevant thing that a lot of people are struggling with, kind of relevance.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's to the point where I was trying to talk about this concept the other day with a client, and I couldn't remember the exact phraseology, and I had a text Matt while I was in session. I just told the client, like, "Hey, wait a second, he'll get back to me in a second." And he did.
Yeah.
But here's what it is. But it's the phrase is, and it relates to this idea of how authentic or transparent, how present we are with people, open.
Yeah.
How open we are in, to use a phrase that was bigger in the early aughts. How real are you keeping it? And and the phrase that Matt uses is this idea of it's kind of three concentric circles of considering how you interact with the world. And the phrase is being authentic with all, being transparent with some, and being vulnerable with few.
Yeah.
Unpack that some for us.
Okay.
Do you know where you picked it up?
I first heard it from a friend and a colleague at the church I work with. Her name's Katie Neely. And we do a podcast for the church there called The Open Door. And we were talking about it in that context. And it just stuck with me as such a helpful tool to use with people, especially in this day and time. As I've worked with a lot of young adults, it's not just with young adults, but I've noticed with some of the young adults I've worked with that they struggle to know how connected they should be with different people in their life. And so it became a helpful tool to kind of give freedom, I think, for people to put people in different levels of openness, based on, I think, factors that are as simple as not easy, but simple as safety and trust. That we as beings are not capable of fully being safe and trustworthy around everybody.
Mm,
I don't think we're even called to that, even scripturally, and so we may dive into that a little bit here in a minute. Um, but then I wanted to we don't also want to be uh, ingenuine or lie to people because we're also called not to lie. And so, like, how do we
mm,
format the openness in that? And so, with those questions in mind, when this was given to me, it helped me put things in frame of what to give other people, of how to engage relationships from these different levels. And so I'll try to explain it without, you know, using just the words of how when you're
yeah.
like, what does being fearful mean? Well, it's to be fearing something. It's like you can, you can't
Yeah.
use the words that the word is. Anyway, so with auth and some of these words kind of, when I would assume as people hear the words authentic, vulnerable, transparent, they're like, well, they kind of all mean the same thing. Um, and to some level, they mean similar things, but I think they do provide angles of like, how much do you give the person in those three circles? So with authentic, I can be authentic with all. And what that means is like if someone I see maybe in the church hallway that I don't know very well says, hey, how are you doing? At times I may say, well, I'm all right, or if I'm doing well, I'll be like, yeah, I'm doing good. I don't necessarily say why I'm doing good. Maybe to some level, if someone says, "Hey, are you okay?" and I obviously look sad, I may say like, "Yes, I feel kind of down today, but I really appreciate you sharing." They may
Mhm,
have a follow-up question, say, "Well, what's going on?" I may be like, "Well, I don't really feel like talking about it right now, but I appreciate your concern." Like that's authentic,
mhm.
but I'm not giving everything away, right?
Well, let's park
Um,
on that
yeah,
for a second on the authentic, because this is, depending on your cultural context,
that's true.
this can be really tricky.
Yeah,
There's certain cultural contexts that directness is much more valued, and in other ones, politeness is. I was,
niceness, if you will.
nice yeah. Matt and I are in the Southern United States, and there's often kind of talked about the sense of, you know, it's important to be polite and well-mannered, and sometimes that can, by necessity, be a little inauthentic or feel a little inauthentic at time, and it's
Right,
not
right.
exclusive to our cultural space. I have several friends that are English, and it's funny, kind of things there are even phrases that to me, if, if you bring for the English friends I know, if you cook a dish for them or you show them a piece of art or something like that, and they say it's quite nice, that
Mhm.
means it's not good.
Oh, I
Like
didn't
that.
know that.
Yeah, and so, "Oh, it's quite nice," and it's
That's a
and
it's an insult. Oh, okay, got it.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
it's not that's not a good thing for it to be, and
yeah,
it just,
yeah,
some of you, as you're culturally aware of either where you are or where you're coming from,
yeah.
or the people you're speaking into, there are cues and signs you can look at, and what's hard is in English, we have this word "friend," and to say that somebody's not your friend implies a negative view of them, but what's
Mm,
difficult is in a lot of other languages, friendship is the word itself implies a certain level of exclusivity. The most
yeah.
descriptive way I could describe so many people in my own life is I have a lot of people in my life that I would describe as pleasant acquaintances.
Mhm.
But to call them that sounds cold.
Yeah, well,
Say you're a
yeah,
pleasant, but descriptively, that's what it is. They're not truly a friend in that they don't exist within the sphere of my life where there's intimacy exchange and things like that.
yeah.
Um, and
And that's it.
I'm yeah.
Well, that was what you just said was a important phrase that I think we need to highlight is intimacy exchanged. I think a lot of times, um, people look towards friendships as, and this is tricky too because there's a cultural connotation as it relates to Christianity to where we are called to do unto others as we would have them do unto us, right? The golden rule. And so we try to approach relationships, and sometimes they've even counseled this way, to treat the relationship as you would want it to be treated, in a sense of not expecting them to necessarily give you that. Now, there's a difference between expectation and the reality of what is happening in the relationship. I think you know that a relationship can be vulnerable. So if you get to if we're skipping transparency for a minute and getting to the center circle, when intimacy can be exchanged,
Mhm.
right? It's not just the one way place of like, I can give all this. Now, we have this unique opportunity as counselors to play the role of an intimate friend or vulnerable friend with somebody. And I use that friend term lightly just because it's not truly friendship. Um, but they are giving us very intimate, vulnerable things. I'm not exchanging them with them. And
Yeah,
so
it's a
it's,
unidirectional
yeah.
relationship.
And so I can't technically be within their small circle. I
Mhm.
can maybe play a part for a season, but I can't be one of the few that is in that circle.
Yeah.
It has to be someone that can have intimacy exchange. Anyway, I just wanted to make sure that that was a really
Yeah.
good phrase.
Yeah, and it's the I th another way that I would think to describe of being authentic, besides, like, being authentic is authenticity.
Mhm.
It
Yeah,
it
exactly.
is it is I think it's this idea of a deliberate way of being in the world that doesn't engender deceit.
Mm,
I'm not trying to mislead or misguide. I'm trying to show the things that I show accurately.
right.
But that does not necessarily mean I show all things or everyone's entitled to all things.
Mm,
And this is something that I've experienced in the work as a psychotherapist, that I've become very sensitive, not always to my credit, but
mm,
I've become very sensitive to what feels like demands on my emotional space,
yeah.
because you do it for a living and it requires a certain amount of energy and focus. And then I'll be out in more casual social situations. And I may have even given this example on the podcast before, but there's a so Matt and I work in the same office. We are next to a grocery store, Whole Foods Mart,
Yep.
which is a you know great to make healthy choices, not great on the wallet, but give a little, take a little. But
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
and the the grocery opened right as I was moving into this building, and there's a person that's worked there. This person has worked there since it opened. There, I don't know if anyone else has been there
Yeah.
as long. And if this person is working a register, I will go to great lengths to avoid
Oh, no.
going through their line. And here's why. This is not an unkind person. This is not a but this person feels intrusive to me.
Mm,
And given that a common sort of thing in the cultural space that Matt and I inhabit, if I am going through a checkout line at a grocery store, a certain amount of chit chat feels acceptable. Someone
right.
saying, "Oh, you having a
Yeah.
good day?" Or, "Anything else I can help you with?" Things like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a yes or no question. It's one that I can decide how much detail I want to get into.
Hmm.
The problem I have with this person will ask me more probing questions. And a typical one that they'll ask is, "So what do you have going on today?" And I will
Work.
give
Yeah.
yeah, I'll give a very, like, minimal deflective answer, be like, "Work," or "Not much." And
Yeah.
then this person will ask a follow-up question, be like, "Oh, so what is not much looking like for you today?"
Mm,
And immediately, I'm not as far as I'm aware, I've not been unkind. But internally, my mind goes, it's like, "I don't wanna talk with you about this, like, I don't know
yeah.
you."
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the most superficial level of relationship, and because of just the nature of the world, so many of our relationships end up having to be like that. They don't have to be inauthentic. They
Right.
don't there doesn't have to be deceit, and we have to make decisions, this idea of sometimes people will ask things, and this is something that I think will cut through all 3 levels. But and this is something that definitely affects, I think, the work that Matt and I do, and I definitely think about it in couples work and family work. Sometimes people will ask to something that they are not necessarily entitled to, or they have not necessarily proven safe for that information. They want to be let in,
Right.
and there's definitely stuff we can unpack there. But to to put a bow on at least my perspective of authentic, it's this idea of without deceit.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily have to be deep or
Right.
detailed,
Yes.
but I am living in a way that isn't engendering falsehood.
Yes. Exactly. Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. Um, because I think that people struggle whether they say it out loud, that I think that deceit word is something that people don't wanna be. Now the other way that I think that I've used is, in a sense, they wanna be people of integrity, which is, in a
Mhm,
sense, to say aligning what is on the inside with what's on the outside. So, how I feel with what I project. If I were to say, "I'm doing great," like the southern niceness, like, inside I'm having turmoil, I think it kinda adds to the turmoil. Um but and so it's holding these
mm,
boundaries, I think is another way to put it, of
mhm.
I don't find you yet, and it's not unkind to say this, I don't find you yet as someone I know, to directly say to someone maybe, but like
That's
internally
the issue, that's the
to
cultural issue, yeah.
yeah, that's the culture issue. But I think that to inwardly process, do I trust or feel this person is safe, is fair to assess. It's actually healthy to think about.
Mhm. And
Um,
to go back to church culture sorts of things, and I think that is can be an underlying sort of thing that happens in a lot of church culture spaces that, we're brothers and sisters in Christ, we're in this
right,
together, and
right,
oftentimes that becomes
right.
a challenge, to saying that because of this community we're in, because we're living this shared life, you need to not assess
Mm,
safety.
right.
You don't need to not that basically we need to treat everything on the same level.
Yeah.
And that's not scriptural. I mean,
No.
there's a you know, there's several different ways that highlight this. I think the one that came the most to mind to me was Proverbs 18:24. The translation I'm looking at is a man of many with many friends may be harmed, but there's a friend who stays closer than a brother. Another translation I remember learning was a man of many friends comes to ruin.
Mhm.
And it's this idea of if you are open too widely, how might that expose you in ways that doesn't represent wisdom?
Yeah. Yeah, it's non-discerning.
Yes. It
It's risky. I mean, it's bad risky in the sense of I think it's where people get burned a lot, and, back to the young people that I've worked with is our culture, at least in where we are, based on where they either are raised, geographically or through the church, but especially too within the context of our, tech culture, um,
Mhm,
where it is celebrated to expose all the good in your life, like, you share everything. If I have a thought, I share it. If I have this picture, I share it, like, there's a level to which I think even our tech culture through social media has promoted an aspect of openness that is unhealthy. I'm giving
mhm,
everything to everybody. And sometimes it gets to a place of I'm sharing a lot of really deep things that are reserved for maybe different layers that are not
mhm.
appropriate for the social sphere. Um,
Well, and it also breeds inauthenticity. As you're
mm,
talking about, it comes to mind because there's this pressure to share good things, and so people will oftentimes, in this desire to overshare, they will over curate their life, and so they'll be very vulnerable, but not necessarily very authentic.
mhm. Yeah.
Um, a metaphor that's come to mind, Matt, and as we continue to talk through the levels of authentic, transparent, vulnerable, I've thought about the idea of a house. And the first level is it's a house that you're on the outside of looking at, and the shades are drawn. And you can see the windows, you can see the brick or the siding or whatever it is. And so the house is not trying to pretend to be a car or a barn or something like that. I see that this is a house.
Yeah.
Transparency may be where, there are glass doors or the window shades are open and you
Mhm.
can look in. It's
Mm.
in it's in it's in, you know, and not just in a creepy sort of way, but like
Yeah.
there's an invitation to look in.
Yeah.
versus the last bit vulnerable is actually being invited into the house.
That's right. Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
you know, to go sidestep a little bit of what this is like for Matt and I in our work as counselors, because it is there's so much of what we do that is strange, that
Mhm.
we engage in this faux vulnerability in some ways with people, and that our clients often are deeply vulnerable.
Right.
Uh, but it's a unidirectional relationship, and we're also existing for our clients in ways that are set apart from their normal lives.
Yeah.
We don't inhabit the spaces of being their friends or relatives, or I mean, that's against our professional rules
Right.
to be these things. And oftentimes in the work that Matt and I do, we are walking with people, sometimes being read into parts of their lives that they have not shared with anybody.
Mhm. Mhm.
But but even then, even as intimate as the relationship is, even that's qualified.
Yeah.
I don't mind my clients, I don't believe, owe me the they don't have a duty to share absolutely everything in their lives. And there are lots of things about them that I don't know. I am unaware of the the positioning of birthmarks on any of my clients outside of what would be,
Thank
because
God.
yeah, that's not the nature of my relationship with them.
Yeah.
Versus if I was their primary care physician,
Right.
it made more sense for me to know that. And so sometimes it's also the nature of the role.
Right.
And you look at, you know, I that there are things I will share with a male friend that are different than what I will share with my wife. And it's
Mhm.
not even necessarily that I am less genuine or vulnerable with my wife, but the nature of the relationship leads to transparency in different ways. And so
That's
it
right.
goes back to this global thing of thinking about boundaries. And oftentimes where I think church culture gets really unhealthy is this idea of being authentic means this full extreme of that you live without any discernment or boundaries of who you
Yes.
and why and what way.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's been, again, for those listening, as you're probably, if you disagree with this, we'd love to hear from you. And so please let us know. But also, you're probably sitting there thinking, well, where where do I land on this?
Mm,
Maybe it's even, where do my friends land on this? Because likely you've grown up in cultures who have indoctrinated you into different levels of this. Maybe it's been to the place of authenticity means I have to be totally open with everybody, but then that burns me. And
mm,
I think that's sometimes where a lot of church hurt comes from.
mm,
There is a total openness of your life, but not the safety and trust, or even the exchange of intimacy, as you said before, that then hurts people in the process. And so, um, my encouragement would be, as we continue to talk to about this, is to think about in your own sphere of friendships or relationships, even if it is to list them all out and then put them in those spheres and to see who is where. And is it truly for you authentic to all, vulnerable or transparent to some, vulnerable to few?
mhm,
Because I think that at times we may have it like, well, I don't know if I have anybody in my vulnerability sphere. I've counseled people in that, and I've encouraged them at times to, like, all right, take the people in your transparent circle. Who there could maybe you engage into this process to even openly be vulnerable with? Because
mhm,
there is where you can start the process of, like, saying, how can I move people between circles?
mhm.
I would caution against taking someone in your authenticity sphere who's not yet in your transparent circle. I keep using different
Mm.
phrases, but I would hesitate to take an authentic relationship and move it straight into vulnerable, because you have to kind
Absolutely.
of, you move in ways to build trust and safety, and that takes effort and time.
Yeah, there's I wanna give an illustration to what Matt's talking about, and then but also to maybe give a little permission. So,
Mm,
we talked about it, and I'll speak to what how I would define this in my own cultural space, and I do wanna highlight that, I inhabit a certain cultural space as a white Southern male in Eastern Tennessee, there are conventions and rules that I kind of work in that don't necessarily translate
Yeah, that's right.
across. And so think about this of how it fits into to where you are, and it may be different. But going back to the whole question of how uh, I'd see someone, we'll talk about being at church,
Mm,
someone that's in the outermost circle. It's someone who I want to give authenticity to. And they ask me, "Hey, how are you doing?" I want to respond in a way that feels authentic. And I might be like, "Oh, I'm okay."
yeah.
And in my speak culturally, that communicates, not maybe not the best, but I don't want to complain.
Yeah, right.
And it's coded, but it's culturally relevant. And because I don't want to be like, "Oh, I'm great."
Yeah.
We talked
Mm.
in an episode past about spiritual bypass. I don't want to give it's like, the Lord just carrying me in ways that don't necessarily represent my heart in that.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
want to be authentic. In my transparent circle, this is somebody who they live in my life in such a way that they're going to see more.
Yeah.
And these are people. My wife has recently gone through a medical procedure where she's been in a recovery process, and we set up a caring bridge for that, where giving updates for people, and
Yeah.
it was something that we let people into that weren't in our authentic circle. These were
Right.
people that were in our transparent circle,
Yes, that's a good example of that. Yes.
and because we wanted them to see, because these are the people that we felt the exchange of intimacy was appropriate. Like, hey, this is something going on in our lives. We appreciate you all knowing. We appreciate you all praying. We
Yeah.
appreciate the support.
Yeah.
Um, and that's a wider circle. And then the last bit, of course, is these are the people we truly bear our hearts with, but it's a small group. And so hopefully that illustration may help. And the second note I wanted to make was on this idea of permission. And here's a key permission in this. Oftentimes we feel or we believe that in talking about these concentric circles, that having somebody in the innermost vulnerable place
Mm.
is that we owe that to people in our lives based on the role of who they are as a
Mm.
as a
Mm.
parent, as a sibling, as a pastor,
Yeah.
a spouse.
Right.
And this is, if you disagree with this, don't come to me. Talk to Matt. I but here's what
In
I would
it's called info at
no.
churchpsychology.org.
the but I will, as a therapist and as someone who tries to walk as a faithful believer,
Yeah.
this is what I would say. You can have deep regard and respect and honor for somebody in your life, but that does not mean that they are a
Mm.
safe person to be vulnerable with.
That's right. Yeah.
Their
Yeah.
parent I walk with people that their parents do not fit into those. Their parents may not even fit into the transparent place. I do believe that there is duty to care and honor in those relationships, but that does not equate that I can share all these things with you. I know people in their marriages. I do not believe that that is the call to marriage, but we work with people, and Matt and I's work. We are in sometimes some triage places with people in their marriage, and their spouse is not going to be a kind person, a balanced or safe person in that vulnerability. Church Psychology is a production of the Negev Institute, a research, resource, and teaching initiative that aims to provide Christian communities with practical education and consulting to faithfully speak to our needs in mental health, relational science, and human habit and behavior. A great way to support Negev is to start a free membership in our open community library at churchpsychology.org, and then stay connected with our email newsletter to hear about new classes, publications, live forums, and in-person events. Again, you can find all that at churchpsychology.org.
And the thing that is relevant to your call for permission, is not necessarily what I hear you say is a permission for the season.
Yes.
It's not a
Yeah.
it's not a permission indefinitely to say like, well, because my parents or my spouse or my pastor has
Mhm.
hurt me, that I can now indefinitely keep them in the circle of authenticity, or even at times, if I'm honest, I want a fourth circle of, like, disconnected,
Yeah.
or cut off.
I would agree with that. I would
Yeah,
agree within, like, all things are I think with your spouse, you always wanna be living towards, you know, that
vulnerability.
great vulnerability.
Yeah,
But in the season that may not be, and it may be a long season.
yeah.
But I do completely agree with you that that cannot then therefore become an excuse to be avoidant of dealing with some things that should be dealt with.
And this goes into more aspects of conflict resolution, which
Mm,
maybe we'll do an episode on that soon. But,
mm,
I think that there's a level to which this plays out into that verse of, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everybody.
mhm,
There's a call to, if there's conflict or there's rupture within the relationship that has created a lack of safety and trust, and
mhm,
maybe you've had to push people outside of circles, um, to assess, especially with these important relationships that are bound to a new way. Like, it's not just this random person that you've known, but this is your spouse, like that
mm,
type of thing, to pursue it and to assess what broke the safety and trust.
mm.
How do we reconcile that if possible? And then how do we repair so that we can build safety and trust back? And that brings people back into different circles. And so, again, that's more conflict resolution. But I think for the person is to recognize, okay, I have to keep them there for a little bit based on the safety factor. How do I start moving them deeper, closer to me? What do I
Yeah,
need to do that? Maybe it's
and
to see somebody. Maybe it's to,
yeah.
like, talk it out in a way with a third party, but to look at that and analyze it.
Last bit on this is the because you talk about as different people are in different parts of the circles, that people sometimes in the season of life sometimes move into different places.
Yeah,
Sometimes somebody who's in a more transparent place in your life doesn't stay there. And it
yeah.
doesn't necessarily come from a rupture. It
Yeah.
could just be seasonality. I think
I
of
mean, yeah, that happens a lot with, the transient nature of young adulthood. You
mhm,
graduate from college. I was just talking to a guy about this, and he's grieving the loss, I think, of these deep relationships he's had in college. But because of the transition of jobs, the moving, like, I think, in a way, he's noticing these relationships change, and not necessarily all for rupture reasons or break of safety and trust, but that naturally, like, one lives in a different city now, and it's harder to be in contact with that person. And that's hard. Change is hard like that.
yeah, there's grief, and grief is often an appropriate natural response to
Yeah.
the loss that happens in change. We
Yeah.
sometimes think that if we live our life the best way we can, that grief is avoidable, and
Mm.
it's not always. But to get permission to not necessarily try to force things, because by the nature of these concentric circles, they get smaller. You
Yeah.
could only live with so many people in the transparent space and be a healthy person. You can
Mhm.
only live with even fewer people in a vulnerable place. And do want to give a quick personal anecdote of it can move, and not necessarily just in one direction. It can kind of go in and out. I try to not give names as I'm talking about things that may come across as less positive, but for this is a more positive thing, so I'll share a name. I have a friend named Ben, and Ben and I were really close when we were in high school. We became friends in high school, and he was one of my closest friends. And we actually had a janitorial business together, in our late
Ayo.
teens, and we'd have a
Man.
lot to, um and our friendship was based on certain shared phase of life, certain shared interest, and
Yeah.
it just kind of grew apart over the years. And some of it is that there was never a rupture, but his life took on different focuses. My life took on different focuses. We lived in different places and kind of things like that. And what I've noticed though, but he's someone who stayed in my life, and as we're in our 40s now,
Mhm.
he's somebody that there's a I would consider him closer in at this point. And it's not necessarily because we talk all the time or things like that, but I have a deep level of trust with him. And some of it comes from the years he's been in my life, that he's been in that authentic place, that's not necessarily in the transparent or intimate place, but he's been in that authentic place in a way. And our seasons of life have converged again in a certain way. That he's somebody that if I was creating a short list
Mm.
of who I would reach out to in great need, he would be on it.
Yeah.
And I would want to be on that list for him.
Yeah.
And so I think there's there's anyway, but there's n to go back to the verse in Proverbs, not everyone has to be your best friend,
That's right.
and that's okay.
Yeah.
And, in Matthew, Jesus in talking to the disciples, I believe this is Matthew 16, Matthew 10:16. Um, it's talking about sending his disciples out. Behold, I'm sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be wise as serpents, as innocent as doves.
Mhm.
And the call to wisdom is this idea of discernment.
Right.
You're supposed to assess and discern the world
Right.
around you.
Yeah. No, that's good. Even as you mentioned Jesus, maybe I think there's another verse or passage in which we see this from him, but just reflecting on his life in general, he had similar uh, concentric circles in the way he related to the people in his life.
Yeah.
Um,
There were the crowds
there's the
that he
crowds,
there were the
yep,
crowds that would be
and they
around
were
him.
actually considered his disciples too. I mean, like
Mhm,
they weren't just random people, but
mhm,
I mean, they included everybody from Pharisees to disciples to curious Greeks. They were all of them. They were
mhm.
following him around, and he was authentic to all those people.
Yeah. And
Um,
then you kind of move into
yeah,
his core group of followers, the men and
mhm,
women that were his followers.
yep,
There were the 12
yep,
that
that's
he
right.
he invested into in different ways, and he talks about um, in in giving himself in a certain way to that, that, trying to find the verse. It is, um, now it escapes me of the one specifically, but basically where he tells the 12 all of, that I have everything that the Father has given me, I'm giving to you.
Yes,
But even within the 12, there was a his smallest circle was the 3, was
that's
Peter,
right.
James, and John,
Yeah,
where he showed them things differently in early on, and this is told in the 3 synoptic gospels, but of
mhm,
the raising of the dead of Jairus's daughter.
yeah,
And in 2 of the gospels, in Mark and in Luke, there's in raising her, he says to them, "Do not tell anybody,"
yeah,
which includes the other 9.
right.
And the same thing, it's the same people that witnessed the transfiguration. They
Mhm,
are let into an aspect of Jesus's power and his deity that were not seen in that moment. And
and
yeah.
and his grieving. They were the 3 that were a part
Mm,
of in the Garden of Gethsemane where he was desperate. I mean, desperate is a strong word because
mhm,
he is Christ, but he was deeply desiring their attentiveness to be with him in his suffering,
mhm,
um, continuously calling them to pray with him, only if what stones throw away to hear his weeping and
mhm,
crying and despair, yet they fall asleep, and the disappointment that he has with that, and to call that out of them, and
mhm.
so all of that is, there's a reason he invited those 3 and not all of them.
Yeah.
Um,
And it was a vulnerability that even wounded him. 'Cause
yeah,
that's the other thing too, we choose to let
interesting.
people in. It doesn't necessarily
Yeah,
mean that that vulnerability is always safe.
yeah,
To go back to the verse I was trying to think of, is John 15:14 through 16. And this is to the 12. "I do not call you servants anymore, because a servant does not know what his master is doing. I have called you friends, because I have made known to you everything I've heard from my Father."
yeah, yeah,
And so Jesus had this discernment process
that's
of
right.
certain people coming in different ways, and certain people are shown different things in different times.
Mm,
And even, for the I this was a sermon I heard fairly recently, and because sometimes certain disciples get a bad rap, and one of the hardest one is Thomas, because
Yeah.
he gets known as doubting Thomas. But
Yeah.
in the story of Jesus and the resurrection with Thomas, you know, part of what he's asking is when he's expressing his doubt to the other disciples, is they all have seen Jesus and he hasn't.
Mhm.
And they saw him when Thomas was out. I think he was getting food or something like that. Again, they were cowering, hiding in
Yeah.
the upper room, and Jesus showed up.
Yeah.
And so we give Thomas a bad rap, but he wasn't given what the other disciples were given.
That's right.
But then when Jesus appeared to him, Thomas didn't push it, because what Thomas said was, if I can put my hands in his side and touch his wounds, like, then I'll believe. And Jesus appears and says, "Here I am." Like, and Thomas doesn't, go, "Okay."
Mhm.
Like he
Mhm.
goes with, and poor Thomas gets known as a doubter, but in
Yeah.
that, there is, it's not even necessarily favoritism, I think, because I think, um, there is deep love and calling that in Jesus's ministry that he has for different people,
Mhm.
that it wasn't necessarily these 3 are my favorite, but these are the 3 that I am vulnerable with in this way,
Yeah.
even to my cost.
Well, in that vulnerability, to carry that thought on a little, at least 2 of the people that are part of that trio is John, who wrote one of the more powerful, not they're all great gospels, but the one that actually was written later has such, like, power behind it and relates to, um, its impact on kind of the Greek world moving on. And then, Peter, who was the foundation of the church as it went on, and, like, and as much as they disappointed him or let him down, despite, like, amongst his vulnerability, he used that to bond deeper with those, um obviously John's writing the gospel, but, calling him, I forgot the phrase now, beloved
Mhm.
disciple, like,
The
just,
disciple that Jesus loved.
yeah, just, like, such intimate language as it relates to his relationship to him.
Mhm.
But then with Peter, like, one of the biggest letdowns, uh, or hurts, or even if you wanna use the word traumas of Jesus in his relationship, is when Peter denied him.
Mhm.
Um, Yet later, Jesus was so beautiful in John as it's written. Peter denies him 3 times. Jesus gives him 3 times to acknowledge his love for Jesus.
Mhm.
And then Peter gets the calling of feeding and tending to Jesus's sheep.
Mhm.
And so there's such beauty in the reconciliation of rupture within the people that are in the intimate circle,
Mhm.
that then, like, drastically changes those lives.
Mhm.
Now, obviously, that's all Jesus doing this, who's perfect in all things. And so it's hard for us to attain that type of repair from a rupture.
Mhm.
But as you were saying, it relates to, like, even people in your intimate circle have the propensity to harm. Jesus was well aware
Mhm.
of that harm, but I think also showed us avenues to repair and what that
Mhm.
does.
Yeah. So, as we're considering these things, I wanna maybe kind of, as we reach towards the end of talking about some of more of what this looks like too in our work as therapists, oftentimes we're navigating in any sort of relational work we're doing, couples work, family work, oftentimes it is people are trying to navigate that level of the different levels of intimacy and expectations.
Yeah.
And we deal with a lot of culturally informed false beliefs about so many relationships. Matt talked today earlier about the how social media culture has kind of created this idea that I kind of lay out my entire life, and by being fully um, by letting everybody see everything without qualification, that's somehow virtuous.
Yeah.
And it isn't necessarily. It can be conceited, it can be unhelpful, because there are things that people are not necessarily entitled to know or should know.
Yeah.
I, yeah, when I'm working with couples, and particularly if there's some difficulty that they're working through, I will often encourage them to find confidants outside of their marriage, even if it's a shared thing. I think of work I've done with couples struggling with infertility,
Yeah.
and that's a very hard thing because you're in it together and it affects you different
Yeah.
ways, and
Yeah.
it is good to try to be able to be authentically present with one another, but it's really hard to bring all your vulnerabilities because it can be the other person is not a neutral party in it.
Mm.
And some of what we offer in uh, to friends that aren't necessarily intimate family members is because we experience a certain level of detachment, or we may have certain wisdom because of
Yeah.
lived experiences or other things. Um, and I keep on going back to the idea of marriage work that I've worked with a lot of couples that their idea of intimacy in their marriage is that every thought that pops into the
Right.
other person's head, I'm entitled to know.
Yeah.
And I can tell you as a marriage therapist, no,
Mm.
no. Like
Mhm, mm,
one of the things I say to couples a lot is it is very important for you to live truthfully with one another.
mm.
Truth is not synonymous with every fact.
Yeah.
There are any numbers of thoughts that I have on a daily basis that do not represent good or charitable things, and I'm glad that my wife does not read my brain,
Yeah.
and
Well,
vice versa to her.
exactly, and there's a concept of, and I just had this conversation with another person, but, of what's called automatic negative thought,
Mhm,
and usually the first thought that pops in your brain is typically negative
mhm,
and not always the truth of what you believe.
mhm,
Um, Now the trick, so to speak, is that you don't allow the automatic negative thought to fester or take root, and then you kind of obsess over that, but to challenge it and to replace it with what is truth, or just to recognize even that that's what that is. And so, to your point, if I were to then share every automatic negative thought, one, it would be damaging to my
mhm,
spouse, and two, it's not what's truly what I believe.
mhm. Yeah,
Usually it's
we
driven by emotion or a trigger, that's something that has sparked me, like, uh, through maybe fear or sadness or anger, or just something that's popped in my head.
as humans, we are being formed,
Yeah.
and what we have this idea that truth is the most spontaneous version that we come upon, and I don't necessarily think that's any more indicative of truth of any number of things. It
Mm,
is Um, I I am a selfish person, and my thoughts are very selfish so much of the time.
mm,
I don't
mm.
want to be that, and I
Right.
wanna submit myself to a formation process that
Yeah.
allows me to step out of that,
Mm.
and I don't wanna again, I don't wanna be deceitful with my spouse or
You're
other
right.
people that I have intimate relationship with. I want to be always authentic, but
Mm.
vulnerability is something that it is I think it's measured, it's done in different times. Even talking about Jesus, there were moments where Jesus went off by himself,
Mhm.
that what he was contending with in different moments were not shared in those moments.
Right.
And so to think about, and because so many of the themes that Matt and I have been unpacking and will continue to unpack is this idea of life intention and
Yeah.
imbalance,
Yeah.
that we can have this idea of like deep reservations or circumspection where we don't really show a very open or authentic version of ourselves,
Mhm.
or this living in this deep oversharing
Yeah.
that doesn't
Yeah.
represent discipline or wisdom or things like that.
Mhm. Mm.
And if you're struggling with that, maybe see a therapist. It's often what we think about.
Yeah.
So
That's we know some good ones.
well,
We
yeah, we
could
do,
send you
we
that
do.
one. No,
Um,
that's funny.
Matt,
Yeah.
the other thoughts as we continue on this, or get where?
Yeah, I think I don't know if we're at time of final thoughts, but I would just say that we encourage you. I may have said this in some way before, but we encourage you to take just in a sense a uh, assessment of where you are in this. Even as you were saying about these automatic negative thoughts, it was making me think that it may not even be easy to say, like, I can put a person in one circle
Mm,
versus like they encompass all three to some
different
level
moments.
at different moments. Some can't go deeper than the outside circle. So in a sense, thinking more of like a sphere with like core
Mhm,
aspects, I bring people deeper in, but at times I may still have to be authentic instead of totally open with every thought,
mhm.
which again is not necessarily vulnerability. It's more just, uh, what's the phrase? Like loose cannoning. Like we're just like shooting
It's
off every thought is
it's
not
kind of
necessarily vulnerability.
it's kind of exhibitionistic
Yeah,
of that I'm just kind of out in ways that aren't necessarily good reasons,
yeah,
just
yeah.
because I like the attention or because I
Mhm.
feel that all these things matter in some transcendent way.
Yeah.
And
You know,
yeah.
and so take note of where you are with these relationships. I would say for those relationships that are intended to be intimate, um, a best friend that you have that you felt disconnected from, your spouse, if there's a conflict there, your parents, if there's some level of disconnect because of a harm, is to not avoid it, but to press in somehow. And maybe that pressing in is not necessarily just open the door to vulnerability again, but to assess what has broken safety and trust and how do I pursue that?
Mhm,
How do I pursue reconciliation? And sometimes for you, this is the freedom piece that we talked about. I'm going to give freedom to people that at times, based on the other person's choices, you cannot be reconciled.
mhm,
You're called to forgiveness work. Reconciliation is a two-way street. You may pursue forgiveness of this person's act that has harmed you and broken safety and trust, but they don't recognize it nor come in any type of repentance to that situation. And so we can forgive and we can continually forgive because it's not a one time thing.
mhm.
Maybe we should also do a forgiveness episode.
Yeah,
But
I
we,
absolutely.
yeah. And so, all that to say is our call is to pursue it, but that based on their actions and what they choose to do, they may have to stay in the authentic circle.
Mhm,
Um, my call for people and my encouragement is to take note of it, don't run from it, but to address it. But sometimes we're only capable of one way. Does that make sense?
yeah, it does.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a good ending point.
Okay.
Okay.
I feel good about it too.
Yeah.
Well, we appreciate you all listening to us. We uh, will continue to bring you deep thoughts and deep talks from our side of the country. So David, thank you again for what you bring to the table, and we look forward to talking to you more next time.
You as well, Matt. Thank you.
See you soon. Thank you again for being a part of our latest episode of Church Psychology. If you have enjoyed it, we hope that you will share this episode with others in your life. And please do remember to follow, like, and or subscribe to Church Psychology wherever you're finding us, and leave us a review. We look forward to connecting with you again soon.